In this lesson, we're going to be learning how to make the puff pastry dough. Before we start making the dough, let's briefly understand what each ingredient does in the recipe. The first ingredient is all-purpose flour. So the reason I'm using all-purpose flour is because it has about 9 to 10% of protein, and I find that it's really good to make puff pastry with all-purpose flour. Some people use bread flour to make puff pastry, but I found that the texture is not as tender as much as you get from the all-purpose. So if you can get your hands on this, that would be really nice. The second one is salt. So just use some plain kosher salt or any salt you can get. Just make sure that the crystals are small so it dissolves easily in the dough. And the reason we use salt in the dough is firstly to flavor it, and secondly to preserve the dough so it doesn't get oxidized and it lasts longer. The third one is softened butter. So this butter is basically in addition to the butter we'll be using for lamination. In some recipes I've made, there is actually no butter in the dough. We just use the butter in lamination. But through experiments, I've found that if you put a little bit of butter in the dough, it tends to get a bit more softer texture. The texture is more flakier and it's more tender when you eat it. So that is why I'm putting it. So make sure that the butter is soft because it will combine more easily in the dough. And the next ingredient is water. So just use really cold water. So the main difference between a croissant dough and a puff pastry is that there is no yeast in the dough. So that is why we don't really need warm water. And also we want to keep the dough as cold as possible because we're going to put butter in it, and also we're going to laminate it. So just so that the butter doesn't melt in the dough. So use really cold water. The next one is optional, but I would highly recommend using it, is some vinegar. So what vinegar actually does is that if you're storing the pastry in the fridge or even in the freezer, if you don't use vinegar, what happens is that the dough gets oxidized. It gets a really sort of this black layer on top, and it doesn't look nice, and it doesn't taste nice as well. So just adding a little bit of vinegar prevents that oxidation process and also preserves the dough. Now, since we know what ingredients we're using, let's actually learn how to make the dough. Making the puff pastry dough is actually quite easy. You just need to put everything together and make a really rough dough. In puff pastry, unlike croissant, we don't want to develop full gluten content because we are going to be sheeting and rolling and basically folding the dough. So that actually develops a lot of gluten. So it's completely fine if the dough is slightly undeveloped right now. So just add the salt and add the butter as well. So just roughly mix this together. Perfect. Now I'm going to add the water. And the puff pastry dough, make sure that it's not too wet, because if it's too wet, it tends to stick to the surface. So this recipe actually keeps the dough in a slightly drier side, and that will help you get really nice layers as well. So I'll show you when I finish making the dough what's the texture. So just keep mixing it until you get a really smooth ball. And if you're using a stand mixer, you can basically knead it for like 4 to 5 minutes until you get a nice and hydrated dough. When the dough is half mixed, what I'm going to do is basically just pour in the vinegar so that it can combine well. And you can mix the vinegar with the water as well. That's what we do in bakeries. We actually just mix the vinegar with water. When we see that there's no flour left in the bowl, what we'll do is we'll just take the dough to the workbench and we'll start kneading it to develop gluten in the dough. So I'm going to knead it for maybe about 3 to 4 minutes. just so that I get a slightly smooth dough. So when you need it, basically you just push it and you pull it back. You push it and you pull it back. So this basically stretches the gluten strands and develops the dough. We're kneading the dough for 4 minutes and you can already see that the dough feels more smoother now and it doesn't feel as rough, but it's not completely developed. And what I'm going to do is basically just shape it into a ball and rest it on the workbench for about half an hour. So the reason I do this is for the dough to actually absorb all the liquids, and also while sitting on the workbench it will actually develop gluten on its own. It will get a lot more structure. So you'll actually be surprised to see how much gluten it develops if we rest it for 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do now is just put a bowl on top of it, and you can even put a wet cloth on top. So this is just so that it doesn't get any dry spots on the dough, and make sure to cover it. So let's check it after half an hour. So our dough has been resting for 30 minutes now, and let's see how it looks like. So you can already feel it feels more smoother because it's basically absorbed all the water. What I'm going to do is just give it like one fold. Let's just fold it like that. And I'm going to divide this into 2 parts because I want to show you 2 methods of lamination. That's why I'm going to do it in 2 parts. And I would advise, like when you're just starting off laminating, it's always good to get as much practice as you can. So when I was in pastry school, we did it the same way. We always divided the dough into half and we practiced it twice. Because when we enclose the butter in the dough, that's quite tricky. And the more you practice that, the better you'll get at it. So just take a dough scraper and cut it into half. And what I'm going to do is basically stretch it slightly with a rolling pin. Because it will be easier to laminate this tomorrow. That's perfect. And the next one as well. And you can see that the dough actually doesn't stick to the rolling pin even though I haven't used flour. And that is a really good dough. It shouldn't stick to your rolling pin. So if you add more water to the dough, just make sure to reduce it if it's sticking to the rolling pin. So that's fine. Let's rest the dough overnight in the fridge and we'll work on it tomorrow. So I'm just going to wrap it in a plastic wrap. So take a sheet of plastic and put the dough in the center and just cover it really nicely. We don't want any dry spots on the dough, so make sure that it's covered very nicely. We're going to rest this overnight in the fridge so that the dough relaxes really nicely as well as it develops flavor. Because to laminate the dough, it has to be really nicely relaxed. So let's learn lamination tomorrow. After we finish making the dough, the next step is to make a butter block. So what a butter block is basically an even layer of butter which we use to laminate to make the puff pastry. So the reason we make this is so that the result you get is very professional and also trying to replicate a professional pastry environment, because in pastry kitchens we use a butter block. So this is a 15 centimeter into 15 centimeter square. Just take a scale And just draw a square. And I'm not even kidding, like when you actually start using this method, you'll see that the layers you get and the result you get will be really nice. That is perfect. And when you've basically made the lines, make sure to actually flip the paper so that the marker ink doesn't actually touch the butter. That's perfect. And before we put the butter here, what I like to do is fold along the lines so that it's really easy to fold it when you put the butter here. Otherwise, what happens is that if we try to fold it and the butter is there, it might actually just stick and it's not very neat. So just take the edge and just fold it as neatly as you can. Perfect. And I've got about 160 grams of unsalted butter here, and I've really roughly cut it up. So cutting it up makes it easier for it to spread. So I'm just gonna put this here and as evenly as you can. Perfect. And just fold it. So now to spread the butter evenly, I'll just take a rolling pin and just press it down like that so it spreads. And just flip it. Now you can just roll it like that. And if it goes slightly beyond that, that's completely fine. Don't worry about it. The reason I keep turning it is because I want the layer to be really even. So you can see the butter blocks are really even. It's slightly gone beyond the line, but that's completely fine. Don't worry about it. We can adjust that later. Just make sure that it's really even, because that will really help us to get even layers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make another butter block like this, and I'm going to put this in the fridge, and when I take the dough out tomorrow, I'll laminate it. So just having this ready helps a lot in the process. So this is the dough from yesterday. It's really nicely rested. So I'm just going to sheet this out to about 30 centimeters in length and about 15 centimeters in width. So which is twice as much as the butter block. So just put a tiny bit of flour, not a lot, because we don't want a lot of flour on the dough. And just take a rolling pin and roll it out. And you'll feel that the dough will spread really easily because we rested this overnight and the gluten is really relaxed. And I like to keep turning the dough so that you get even pressure throughout. And if you have like any thin spots, what you can do is just stretch it with your hand like that so it becomes even. So let's measure with a scale and check the width. So it's about 30 centimeters, that's good. And this is a little bit about 17 centimeters. So I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller, just like that. And if it's slightly more, don't worry about it, because when we fold it, we can adjust that. So I took the butter out about 15 minutes back. And you want to take the butter out before you start stretching the dough, because if the butter is really hard, when you laminate it, it will crack in the dough. And this also depends on your temperature. So if it's really hot, you might just need to put it out for like 5 minutes. But because it's winters now here, so that's why I left it out for about 15 minutes. So let me show you the texture of the butter. So if I move it, you see that it's bending. And you want it to bend, because if it's too hard, it will crack, and if it's too soft, it will just leak out. So this is really good texture. So let's put it in the center of the dough. Take your sheet like that and just press it down. Just stretch it and fold it to the center, and the same thing here, just stretch it slightly and fold it to the center. So you see how it's nicely sealed here. So now we want to seal it on the edges. So just stretch the dough here as well and just press it down so that the butter gets nicely sealed and it doesn't leak. The same thing here as well. So I'm just stretching this here and I'm stretching this as well. So you just seal it just like that. Perfect. So this is a really nice butter block. I don't have excess dough. So now what I'll do is I'll just put a tiny bit of flour. And you want to use as less as possible to get really nice layers. And a little bit of flour on your rolling pin as well. And what I'm going to do is just press it really gently so that the butter spreads. And this is a really important step because you want the butter to spread really nicely. And then what I'll do is I'll just turn the dough and spread to the sides. And what I've realized is that if you don't do this step, sometimes the butter doesn't spread as well and you get too much butter in the center. So now what I'll do is I'll start rolling it. Really even and gentle pressure from the center to outside. Just from the center, we go outside. Perfect. We want to stretch this to about 50 centimeters. I'll just use a scale and check. So we need maybe about 6 more centimeters. And what I can see is that I can see a little bit of thickness here. So let's make this side a little bit more thinner. And just take the dough and just stretch it like that. So it relaxes it slightly. Perfect. So now we're going to give this a single fold. And before we do that, and a really important step, take a pastry brush and brush off all the flour, because the flour will prevent the layers from rising really well. Perfect. So just fold it to the center. And just brush the flour again. And fold this to the center as well. And just stretch it to the ends. So that's our first fold. And you can see the dough is really nice and even. And that's really good lamination because I can't see any spots of cracked butter. It's nicely laminated. So what I like to do, and this is like a really baker thing, we just put a thumb like that, just to know that there's one lamination which has been done. Because we need to do 3 more. I'm going to rest this in the fridge for about 30 minutes so that the gluten relaxes as well as the butter sets slightly. Otherwise the butter will start to leak out. And we learn the second lamination after 30 minutes. Just put a little bit of flour. And we're gonna roll this again to about 50 centimeters in length, roughly about 20 centimeters in breadth. So just from the center, you put pressure outwards. And when we roll this pastry dough, make sure that you never go beyond this point, because what that does is it destroys the layers in the corner. So just always keep it till here. Always from the center to the sides. And I always keep basically lifting it so it doesn't stick to the surface. So let's check the length now. So it's about 40 centimeters. So let's make it a little bit longer. And if at any point the dough feels too soft, you can like stop and just put it in the fridge, just so that it firms up slightly. Perfect. So I've got the dough to 50 centimeters, and what I'm gonna do before I fold it is just gonna brush off all the excess flour, because that's really important to get really nice layers. So when we give a book fold, we'll take one side to about half the length and the other side as well. So just take it to about half and the other one as well. And make sure to brush off this side. So now what I'll do is just take it from this side and flip it over. Perfect. So you can see it looks like a book, and this will give it a lot of layers actually. I'm gonna rest this for another 30 minutes and then we'll give it another round of single fold and a book fold. So it's time to give the third turn to our dough, and this time we're gonna give it a single turn. Just evenly put pressure on the dough and again stretch it to about 50 centimeters. And doing this basically helps to relax the dough and also make it even, because sometimes the sides can get really thick and you don't want any thick sides basically. Okay, just brush off the flour and give it a single turn. So just in the center. And this also goes in the center. Perfect. So this is really even, and I can also see that the layers are very even as well. Perfect. So I'm going to rest this for another 30 minutes and then we'll give it the last turn. It's time to give the final turn, and this time we're going to be giving a book fold. So again, we want to stretch it to 50 centimeters, and the dough feels really nice now because we've given it so many turns. Perfect. Just brush off the excess flour. And for a book turn, we'll take this about halfway through, and similarly the other side as well, and make sure to fill all the gaps. Just brush off the excess flour and just fold it like that. Just flatten it out slightly. Perfect. So our dough is finally ready. It's got about 4 turns, and now we're just gonna wrap it up and rest it for 30 minutes at least before we make a pastry out of it, so that the dough is nicely relaxed and the butter is nicely set. This dough can be stored in the fridge for about 1 week, and if you want to freeze it as well, you can freeze it for up to 3 months, and you can make so many things out of it. So after you've mastered this, we're going to move on to the next section of the class, where we're going to learn how to make different recipes out of this puff pastry dough.